Catherine Ross, the Executive Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm delighted to be here today with a group of the Provost Senior Faculty Teaching Scholars who will be sharing their experiences and reflections on teaching during a pandemic. We will begin with brief introductions and then move into questions and conversation.
My name is Rita Charon. I'm on the faculty at the medical school at Columbia. I'm the head of the Medical Humanities and Ethics Department. I'm a general internist, I'm a literary scholar, and we are in the thick of COVID, uptown, at the hospital and clinics.
I'm Christos Papadimitriou. I teach computer science at Columbia in the School of Engineering. This was the semester, my not teaching semester that I had carved out of my year carefully so that I can travel. This didn't work very well, but still I'll be delighted to discuss this important matter.
My name is Susan Sturm. I'm a professor in the law school at Columbia and also the director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change. I taught a class this semester called Lawyering for Change. And I also worked on a Pathways project for paralegals that use Zoom to teach law students and formerly incarcerated individuals about paralegal work. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation.
I'm Susan Witte, and I teach at the School of Social Work. Like Christos, I actually didn't teach a formal large-size classroom this semester, but I had a number of opportunities to work with small groups on projects related to my research, which is HIV prevention and implementation, and also leading smaller seminars related to courses that took place last semester.
Great, thank you all. So let's jump in with a big question, thinking about the impacts of this COVID-19 crisis on your teaching, or on everything you were doing. What has been dynamic and interesting? What's been challenging? Christos, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely, thanks. I mean, as I said, I have very little first-hand experience on this. You know, I've been helping colleagues cope, but I've been immersed in the dialogue in my department and beyond about this. You can imagine that computer scientists have a special interest and take on what's happening. In the past, I have recorded the lectures and parts of courses for MOOCs, for online courses. So I want this to be different. Okay? And the question is, in what sense? You know, how can I achieve this? Okay, so you know, when I teach, I am my energy source is are the bodies in the class. Okay, so you know, how can I replace this?
I see a lot of nodding, so whoever would like to expand on this, please. Go right ahead.
Well, I'm glad you said the word bodies, bodies in the classroom, because at the medical school, we have been unable to let our students go into the hospital. So there is an end to the clinical training right now, except what we can create on Zoom. So my group and I have been teaching narrative medicine, that's the bringing in of arts and humanities and creativity into medical practice. We have quadrupled our teaching of that. And in these small groups of students, oddly, one of my faculty says, he feels more able to feel the class as a unit. Unlike having separate bodies in the chairs, but it's dramatically different. I can't wait to hear how it's working in law and social work, because you have the same kind of clinical hands off.
Yeah, that's the fact that you're reporting both greater intimacy and more challenge in the medical school really jives with my experience in Lawyering for Change. So Lawyering for Change is already an interactive course that's focused on building a community of people who are helping each other learn how to be change agents.
Mhm.
So the fact that we were a community beforehand, that people already had experience with each other of intimacy, that there was an idea about bringing the whole person into the space while we're also engaging with outsiders. And there are already breakout rooms in the form of collaboratories, really set up Lawyering for Change to make probably an easier transition to Zoom than a civil procedure class. Which was a very different type of classroom. And so I saw, in terms of surprises, there were some aspects of the course that were really more intimate and more interactive. Students reported, I got to interact with different one-on-one people in a way that I might not have in the classroom because people were randomly paired. People talked about finding a level of comfort and intimacy in their collaboratory conversations that felt seamless for them with what they had experienced in the classroom. And I heard, for example, curating their comments in advance so that I could prepare people for jumping into the larger conversation, which is something I never did before, really made it possible to have a very dynamic conversation on Zoom with 43 students. Having said that, there were many students who did not speak in Zoom in the group of 43, who were more willing to speak when we were in a classroom. There's something about having your face show up for 43 other students that really was chilling for some students. And also, there was a concern about the people seeing people's homes.
Yeah.
So people commented about the challenge of being in a space that they didn't want others to see, either because it was cluttered or for whatever reason. So people were differential in their willingness to have the video camera operating during the classroom, which created this kind of differential in participation, which was challenging. And I'll just say, finally, students responded very, very differently to Zoom. There were some people who found this absolutely distancing and silencing and disconnecting and just couldn't wait for Zoom to be over. And there were others who found the transition to be seamless, and a few who even preferred Zoom, although that was certainly not the majority. So if we're able to create really effective one-on-one or small group interactions combined with a way to curate the larger setting, I think the transition worked. I would say I would be very skeptical about doing this without having first built a community in real space and time. And I would be very concerned about moving to a fully online space because students mourn the loss of our classroom community.
Yeah. I think this mixed experience, or in social work, I feel like I'm hearing about and experiencing more of a mixed experience in terms of the challenges that I guess what the Chronicle of Higher Ed called a pedagogical triage, right? So here we are, we're all doing online courses, and for some students, there's an assumption that it should be like online courses. And the disruptiveness of the change this semester has really made them feel quite uneasy about the quality of education that they're getting and their capacity to interact with their peers. And half of our pedagogy actually takes place in field agencies. So the students spend 21 hours a week in a community-based agency. So having lost that and being remotely connected, maybe half of our agencies are really able to continue with remote learning. So for some, it's been entirely disruptive and very unnerving and very challenging. For others, there's been this amazing thriving of recognizing the capacity to step in, that the world is a dynamic place. This is an emergency. And I think we see students who are taking leads in roles in agency remote settings and in classrooms that maybe they didn't realize they could have taken. But I think this, one of the opportunities that this has created is the capacity to put your professional ideals and skills to work immediately. And I've been really impressed to see, as we see across campus, there are volunteer efforts that are growing. And some students have just stepped right into their agency settings and taken the lead with administrators to identify what are the gaps, doing a quick needs assessment and beginning to get online or on the phone with students, with families to triage. So that's been very exciting in terms of what.
And just to notice, to build on what you were saying, Susan, about students stepping in, I've noticed that faculty have also formed a different kind of relationship with students. That we are research teaching scholars. And I've noticed that there have been faculty that have created new kinds of relationships with students to respond to the pandemic and integrated those into various kinds of teaching, to the point where one member of our faculty organized an online book that faculty put out in a week and involved students in doing that kind of research to link teaching and research with impact. So I'm seeing also, Susan, your report of people taking advantage of an opportunity to really change their identity to being activist scholars and activist students, integrating teaching and learning in a really different way.
Yeah. I have a question for Christos. Something that Susan said gave me a new picture here. You said that your students, in effect, had to imagine their agency. They couldn't go to it, so they had to imagine it. I mean, Christos, does this kind of digital life increase our capacity to really imagine and create things that we can't see?
There are many things that can be reached online. So, they are not the most important ones, okay, but such things exist. And of course, reality is limiting, and then you can have a more enhanced reality. Frankly, when something like this strikes, we are all obsessing with the question, what can get better out of this experience? Okay, so what is it that in the world or in my world can be improved? Okay, so and one should stop and think, what especially if you're teaching undergraduates, what an incredible change this is. Okay, if you think about it, the curriculum, every class has been altered, has been completely transformed by assessment. Okay, so in other words, we choose the topics so they can be testable. Okay, so the students focus on things that they know are going to be on the exam. Okay, so when you tell a great idea, people will think, but can it be tested? Should I? So I think it can be incredibly liberating. I really feel that education has been dealt a bad turn by the assessment business. Okay, so listen. If you are an engineer and if you are a physician, you have to of course qualify. I don't know if you know, but here is an etymological sort of like tangent. The word school comes from an ancient Greek word, scholi, which means free time. Free time, and of course in a slave society there was a lot of free time. What do you do in free time? You think, okay? So and if a lot of clever people think together, they create a belief system and a world outlook that they call scholi, okay, which means what we did in our free time. Okay, so this is how the school of Aristotle and Plato and so on was formed, and the rest is history. Okay, it was another thing that I love is that the ancient Greek word for profession is ascholia, which means deprivation of free time. Okay, and sometimes when I teach my class, I think that my deprivation of free time is to deprive my students of their free time by assigning as much homework as I can get away with. Okay? So and they're going to do it because they want a good grade. Okay, and this is all this is now is now under the table. So it doesn't exist. Okay,
Wow.
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for something completely new
Great.
to be experienced and maybe continue.
Thank you.
So I'd like to dig a little deeper into these themes. You've mentioned the differing reactions to Zoom engagement, and also what Christos and others have brought up is the student reactions to the pass-fail situation. Did the freeing from grades, how that's impacted student perceptions of learning and the value of what they're learning? Students have so many identities and needs that they don't leave outside our physical classrooms, and certainly can't shut off in a remote learning situation. And you've mentioned that they're very mixed. Some students embrace this, but other students may not have. I personally have been hearing very mixed reactions from students to the question of grading. So how do we attend to this range of reactions to Zoom, to grading? How do you remain sort of person-centered when you don't physically get to meet with your students?
So, how do we stay engaged with students with so many different needs? So I think it really is helpful to have some method for individuating in the classroom generally, in order to respond to the fact that people respond very differently to the situation in Zoom. So some of that is, first of all, to get feedback from students about what their needs actually are in the situation. It's a little easier in a course like Lawyering for Change, because that mix is already built into the structure of the class. So I wasn't forced to create it for the first time in the pandemic. I think it's much harder to move to Zoom and then change your whole modality from focusing purely on content and productivity without taking into account where every student is in the class. And I think, just as Christoph has said, that could be a positive development. The fact is that if we haven't taken into account where people are, they're not going to be learning fully anyway. So I think there's an opportunity to learn from Zoom, learn from the pandemic. There's an opportunity to learn from the pandemic that if we want people to learn, we have to actually take into account the fact that they learn differently and have different needs, including in a pandemic. So, for example, the class after we started Zoom, the focus was on difficult conversations. How do you have difficult conversations using that kind of a framework? There were some students who really wanted to talk about the difficult conversations they were facing with their roommates or their family members connected to COVID-19. And there were some students who wanted to talk about the difficult conversation that they were sick and tired of talking about the pandemic in class. And they really needed to focus on the material so that they would have some degree of normalcy at some point in their lives. So it was fortunate to have a class that actually created a structure for people first to voice their different needs, using it actually as a learning tool for us to master or begin to master a framework about difficult conversations, and then have students report back about what their different views were in a way that I could learn from, so that we could then tailor the rest of the semester to try to respond to different needs in different classes. So no one could be, there wasn't a class in which everyone could be happy, because people did have such different needs. But over the course of the rest of the semester, first of all, we could be attentive to the fact that people actually had different needs. So you had to respond to that and then tailor different classes to these different kinds of needs. Would not have been able to do that so easily in a class like civil procedure, where the focus was so really students were focused so completely on simply actually mastering the material. And fortunately, we meditated a little bit at the beginning of every civil procedure class, so that created some kind of opening for that. But I think it would have been a lot more difficult. And my colleagues who are teaching things like administrative law or criminal law, I think had a much more difficult time managing this very different reaction on the part of students.
Yeah. Susan?
I was just going to jump in on this idea of, and Susan, I think you had alluded to it earlier, this idea of students at home through this lens. I'm looking at all of you, and how in the classroom, especially in social work, we're always talking about positionality. Sort of, how do I identify? What are the many roles that I take on and that I play? And I think right now, I bless you, as an instructor, I'm much
Zoom
more
challenges. Sorry.
How we focus students in working with clients in the field. But what I'm realizing, as my students are also sort of my clients, in the sense that I need to understand where they're coming from. You alluded to that. And in the home spaces that many of them are in, their multiple identities are not able to be hidden in any way. So we choose to disclose or to be who we are in the classroom. And in the classroom, we have time to sort of create a space that by using meditative practices or letting go of what's outside and then refocusing. And I think that exercise to sort of begin to learn in the classroom setting each week is much more complicated by the fact that we're in these home spaces where we're mother, daughter, sister, partner,
dog.
And for many of our students, something I left out earlier, they are experiencing some of the same dynamics that we're sort of seeing as we observe the media. And I know, Rita, you and your colleagues are seeing at the medical center. And that is that many people who are affected most directly by this pandemic, we're finding out are people who have been living in adverse conditions that have been due to lack of social justice for decades, for centuries. So the students who were economically disadvantaged before COVID-19 that's more exacerbated for them.
Yeah.
And each of those issues, that we could list out also impedes their capacity to continue learning in the same way. And so we've been trying to have conversations where we can be mindful about how to help remove those barriers. And I know the administration has been working on that. At the same time, we're still trying to do that person-centered connection in the classroom and among students. So let me stop.
Wow. Let me just throw in an example of a bigger canvas. Some of the work we're doing in narrative medicine is to reach out way beyond Columbia to persons who are suffering social isolation and anxiety and worry and fear. And also just a sense of not being an agent. I'm just sitting here doing nothing. So we've invited, like way big through our social media network, people to come to a Zoom session for an hour and do some reading and writing and creative work with colleagues. And we're getting like 100 people at a time. Wow. We're getting persons from the US and Canada and Poland and Greece and Macedonia and Turkey. I mean, it's incredible. And it's 100 people. And I mean, we've trained facilitators to be able to present a work, a text, an image, a video, and then encourage a discussion. And 100 people will take turns and they raise their hands and there's a very rich discussion about whatever this object is. And then we give them a prompt, a writing prompt, and in 4 or 5 minutes of silence, each of these 100 people on all these continents sit there and write. And then some of them get to read what they've written or put it on the blog. So it's a way to reach way, way outside. And of course, include our students in it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Have any of you found yourselves having to address sort of existential dread or personal losses from COVID-19 in your classroom settings or among your colleagues? And how did you handle these conversations?
I'm in touch with my graduate students, and one master student who was taking a reading course with me rationally decided to go to Korea, where he would be with his family, and it so happened that he was picked up at the Seoul airport and was sent to a hotel where he was kept for 5 weeks. Because he could not get 2 consecutive negative tests. So I was in touch with him through this ordeal, he's the coolest kid I've seen, but it had affected him a lot. So
Wow.
he was collapsing. We ended up talking less about his research and more about his situation and how to breathe. Yeah.
Sure.
And I'm finding also that particularly in a context where there's already some attentiveness to people's well-being and the way in which that affects their learning, that students and colleagues in that setting have brought to the surface really difficult situations that they're facing with their family members or with themselves. Everything from dealing with family members who are not taking seriously the need for social distancing, to people who are embarrassed about worrying about their professional well-being and whether they're going to get a job when their colleague or roommate is worrying about, the survival of their family members or things that are much more life-threatening. And so it has been necessary and important to create a space for people to talk about that. And part of what I think has been helpful in doing that is to find ways in which people can connect that to their academic or pedagogical work, so that students have been invited to make a project out of, for example, dealing with domestic violence.
Yes.
And the impact of domestic violence when they are themselves survivors and are feeling the effect of being sheltered in a place and vicarious trauma. And so for some people, being able to do something about that as a way to bring that home, giving people the option to work through a problem through the lens of COVID-19 that's relevant to something that we're doing in class, particularly as an individual reflection. So it's not something that everyone has to do. That seems like it's created an opening. And I'll just say one thing I hope comes out of this, and I think one big question for us is how do we sustain this attention when we're not in the crisis, is a greater understanding that we're in a much more extreme version, as Susan has referred to. We're in a much more extreme version of situations that are facing people every day, and that we've just been ignoring. What are the circumstances under which someone is learning? What are they facing day to day? And that's at Columbia. Think about this in the context of community colleges, where people are, dealing with issues of hunger or inadequate medical care or inadequate housing as just a routine of daily life. Can we learn that we can't help people learn effectively if we don't take account of the personal circumstances that they face? And can we build that more intentionally into the way we teach?
Yeah. And critical.
Absolutely. We've had a number of students who were ill. So then there's one of my doctoral students sort of disappeared for 2 or 3 weeks, and of course, I would come to find that she was sick and recovering. And we actually at the school had an opportunity to mourn together. Sadly, about a month ago, when our first student died of COVID. I guess as you were talking, Susan, I was thinking about how the boundaries between administration and faculty and students, since we're all going through this at the same time, are becoming quite blurred. And on the optimistic side, there's that opportunity to share some of these rituals together and to realize how it impacts us, and hopefully hold that into the future, and to see how do we capitalize on that in ways that meet the needs of our different constituencies, in ways that sort of liberate or democratize the feelings across those units that are typically quite, stealthily protected.
And, our students are seeing lots of illness and lots of death even. And they're seeing something that they never would have seen about this profession too. And it even makes them wonder, do they really want to be in it? I'm talking now about the medical students. We have been redeployed. We've got pediatricians who are redeployed into take caring of adults in intensive care units. And we've got the urologist down in the medical emergency room doing something he wasn't trained to do. But somehow we all answer the call. And persons are getting sick, and persons are losing heart, and persons are ending up in our intensive care unit. So to this point, talk about existential dread. I mean, these students are seeing their own role models sacrificing themselves.
So the focus of moving forward brings us to our final question, which is, how will all of these experiences that you've all so richly described and captured here change perhaps what happens when we return to physical classrooms, or to more, I guess, for lack of a better word, normal circumstances? What will we be taking forward?
Everything. I mean, it's this. I wonder if we look back at this conversation in the future, we might say, "Wow, these were different times," or we might say, "Wow, you see, back then we thought it would be temporary." Yes. So the question is, how can this turn to something good? I mean, also, I can see that a lot of absurdities that in modern society have been exposed, like sort of the lack of access to medical care by many people, and so on. So the inequities across borders or within the same country of care and all that. But I mean, more, how is this going to transform education? I mean, besides the possible catastrophic ways, sort of, that we all agonize about. And I mean, the little thing that I came up with, sort of, reassessing assessment, sort of, is one I'm going to push, especially in computer science, where realizing that this is feasible and sometimes sometimes advantageous. So this online medium is going to be helpful. I mean, it's an extra tool. So we don't have to use it. We had to use it now. We got good at it, and maybe nothing. Nothing replaces sort of eye-to-eye contact. But if you are able to get something out of this, that's I mean, all my career, I remember people asking me, So how long do you think that how much longer will this university business continue? I mean, don't you see that computer instruction is going to take off? So this is a jolt in this direction. I mean, it had never occurred to me that they were right. Okay, so I don't think this will happen. Okay, so frankly, mostly because when children get to the age of 18, they have to go somewhere. Okay, and I cannot think of a better place. Yeah. So, but I mean, it's true that technology changes things. Okay, so changes things for the better, for the worse, or for the bizarre. Okay, so
Let me just add that it's not just the digital parts that are different. Everything is different about learning and teaching right now. And just the top of my list is this situation has flattened the hierarchies in healthcare. And the nurses and the social workers and the physical therapists and the physicians have a markedly different kind of relationship. Great deal more trust, respect, leaning on one another. Wait, I don't know this. Tell me this. And we are so hoping that kind of egalitarian action among the professions can continue.
Well, and the kind of intentionality about interaction and relationships that has been forced by this situation that, Rita, you're highlighting in this one dimension of redefining power and redefining expertise. Is there a way in which that can be kept front of mind as we move forward? So I'm thinking about intentionality about how we use who participates in the classroom space.
Yes.
That up to now, I think we've said either it's online or it is in a physical classroom space. And I think this experience has opened up my thinking about ways in which we can, in a very intentional way, expand who participates in a live classroom experience and do that in very intentional ways. I think we can invite forms of collaboration in the class as homework in ways that I have never really done before, but that seem like they're doable if you're not insisting that people meet physically, but that they interact on Zoom. I think there are ways of thinking about assessment that that ways of tracking things and participation. I hate to say it, that people are worried about moving away if you don't have grades, but are there ways to gauge levels of engagement by having things take place in a virtual space that will allow us to move away from not only grades, but we have a very fixed curve in the law school that I think is one of the most deleterious causes of real engaged learning. So maybe that's a possibility. And then the last thing I'll say is I have been transformed by this experience into a kind of activist that I don't think I've been fully as a teacher, that I can't afford to not engage with the world, not just through my students and what they are doing. And so I will continue to work on incarceration and decarceration as a kind of focal point of work in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And I'm wondering if this will encourage people to engage in a more ongoing way with the consequences of our pedagogy and our research for these problems that we now know are life and death, and that will continue to be life and death in ways that may be less visible after the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah. You want to wrap us up, Susan Witte?
Oh, I think my colleagues have shared so many wonderful insights about where we're going for face-to-face teaching. I guess the one thing that I still I'm thinking about when we go back to face-to-face is this idea of bodies and physical distance and proximity and intimacy. And I feel a little prepared to discuss it with any real depth and super thoughtfulness here, but it concerns me as we move forward. So wanting to make sure that we attend to, even in this new reality, that until we have a vaccine, my assumption is that we will be physically distanced from each other. And so Zoom does that automatically, but when we're in the same spaces, what will that do to our interactions? And so especially in the helping fields and social sciences, where so much of how we use ourselves interpersonally matters.
Yes.
I think it raises a host of ways to think differently about interactions, and it brings us to wanting to attend to cultural differences, relational, contextual issues, and so that's really I've been struggling about thinking about how we'll integrate that into our curriculum moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all. This has been a fabulous conversation, so rich, and I feel like it could go on for several hours, but I think given the levels of Zoom fatigue everyone is experiencing, we'll stop here. And I deeply appreciate your willingness to share all of your experiences with others. So thank you.
I just want to say, like, how moved I am by each of you.
Yeah.
And what you're doing and how you're approaching this. It almost brings me to tears just to hear what each of you is doing with your teaching and your colleagues. And just, it's very inspiring to me. And, the depth of thoughtfulness and engagement. I just learned a lot from hearing all of you. I benefited tremendously from this conversation. So thank you.
Same here.
Thank you so much. And Catherine, thank you for making this happen. I was not looking forward to it. I will say, I was like, why did I agree to this? I have so much to do, and, I'm just very, very grateful to have participated. So thank you.
Oh, well,
Thanks.
thank you. I think it's marvelous
A real pleasure
to be able to share this with others.
Yep.
So I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much,
everyone.
Bye.
See you around.
Yeah.
Stay healthy.
Please take care.
You too. Stay safe.